Look, it's a really great question because one of the funny things, Tom, like I probably worked with 60 different, mostly VC-backed B2B SaaS companies at this stage.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Confessions of a B2B Entrepreneur. My name is Tom Hunt, your host, and today we're interviewing Alan Gleeson, who is a very experienced fractional CMO and the co-founder of a company called Contento. So what we do today is we dig into Alan's wisdom in B2B marketing over the roughly 1 or even close to 2 decades he's been in the game. And then we also talked about what he's doing with Contento and his approach for that business based on his experience as a fractional CMO in the B2B world. So before we jump into that, quick shout out to Fame, who are the producers of the show. They're also creating the video clips through a recent acquisition we did called Lychee that will soon not exist and it will just be Fame. So if you like a show like this or clips like us, then go to fame.so and we will love to help you. Request a proposal, let them know that Confessions of a B2B Entrepreneur sent you. Let's jump into this discussion with Alan now. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Delighted to be here.
I feel like there's a lot of B2B marketing wisdom to share.
Hopefully we might get a dialogue going. I think on both sides, right? You've been at this game a long time as well.
But what I like about your back history is that with a fractional consultant model, you've been inside a lot of high growth B2B startups. So my first question is, I'd love to understand what has kind of changed, maybe since you got into the B2B game. And I think this was back looking at your work history back in 2010s. Is that right?
A long time ago. And actually I did study academically what was known as industrial marketing back at the time. Look, we're on video now. When I started, it was all written. It was a very, very different world. I think there's been a number of things going on, right? It's like SaaS is still relatively new, right, Tom? I mean, if you look back, I don't know, do you remember 56K dial-up?
Where I made the funny noise?
That's exactly it. So I remember I worked for FreeServe at one point, Tom, where you needed to get a disk next to the internet.
Yeah.
You had 56K. And when you think about that, how crazy it is. So everything was slower. You couldn't have SaaS, right? I first sold software as a boxed piece of software. I was into PC World and Gleeson's trying to sell software. So an awful lot has changed. I guess I touched on a couple of things. So one thing, we're doing really rich video and audio and podcasts now. So that's kind of one thing, video production quality that you get that, of course, you couldn't get back in the SaaS days when it first started. So we're now beginning to see AI come in. We're now seeing a world where all of a sudden there's sort of the playbooks and the models that worked a few years ago are now becoming really, really difficult to work effectively. So lots of different things have changed, some for the good, some for not so good.
Yeah. What are you seeing in those things that maybe are not working well that worked 2 years ago? Is it cold email or so other things?
Look, it's a good question, right? I think you can tackle it a few different ways, Tom, right? So if you look at some of the access points into people's world, right? So we're all trying to capture attention, right? Google is essentially that's a key channel. And just a few years ago, you kind of had decent access to Google homepage. If you did a good SEO job, good organic job, you had a fighting chance of getting access to that, right? That's no longer really the case. Each year, they've kind of rolled back the organic piece, dialed up the paid. The paid is a bit problematic. I'm obviously using paid for some of my clients and there's intense competition. Pricing is getting much higher. I'm seeing quite a bit of click fraud at the moment. So your Google access point, I think, is definitely more stressed unless you've got deep pockets, right? If you've obviously got deep pockets, you can push paid, which I guess is where the direction of travel is, right? And then another access point would historically have been, let's say, LinkedIn in the last few years for B2B. And again, we can touch on this afterwards, but I'm finding that less effective, right? Because again, LinkedIn being LinkedIn, they're now trying to kind of monetize their asset, right? So all of a sudden, the network that you've built up that gave you reach organically is now becoming less effective, again, as they look to try and push you down paid routes. Email is the other one you touched upon. And I think newsletters are definitely an interesting route in, but also leveraging third-party audiences, a bit like this, where we're kind of co-authoring a piece of content that we can share with our respective audiences. So I've kind of shared a lot of points there. I don't know, do you want to deep dive in on any of those? But I'm sure some of them resonate with you, right?
Yeah, I like your idea of access points. And so there's probably really 6 to 8 I think. This would be good to list them out. I think you mentioned 4. So Google, LinkedIn, email,
Yeah,
events,
correct.
partners,
Yes.
and like networking. That might actually be it. That's 6. Am I missing something?
Well, I think cold, right? So Cognizant, which is a former client of mine, are on 80 million ARR, right? They're a real fast growing UK company. They're all about outbound. Obviously, that's more on the kind of sales side than the marketing, but they try and get in through email, but also through phones. And they're clearly effective at what they do. But events had a kind of an interesting period through COVID, right? And we've come out the back of that, and there's virtual events. So I guess the point here, really, right, is ultimately the access points, I think, are increasingly paid, right? It's more difficult to get through organic channels. Of course, there's always some exceptions, but it does mean paid routes are becoming increasingly important, which brings us full circle. If I wear a European hat for a second, often there's a kind of an unfair advantage that the Americans have, because often you'll find that they will have raised a lot more cash, right? Probably Reid Hoffman blitzscaling type approaches where they're happy to burn cash versus a more frugal approach in Europe that might have been effective for the last few years, but I think is now being stressed a little bit more for some of the reasons I've outlined.
Yeah, good point. So the pressure is going to be on paid. And so that's just going to impact margins, right? And so with companies just going to have to increase prices.
I think it's a good point. So I think there's a couple of things here, right? So maybe it means bigger raises if you are in technology and you're, what would have been a seed or pre-seed raise a few years ago, I think doesn't get you as far. And therefore, that's something to think about, right? Potentially just raising more cash up front and realizing actually that a couple of 100,000 pre-seed that just doesn't really get you. There'll always be some edge cases, but by and large, it doesn't get you far enough to get you into the game. Raising prices is a tricky one, right? But I think the other point I'd say is you do have to kind of then be resetting kind of growth expectations, I think, and just having realistic conversations with the kind of C-suite about, okay, the business plan to raise investment suggests that these hockey stick kind of figures, but the reality is most of the industry sectors are on a slower growth trajectory than they were a few years ago.
That leads nicely onto my next question, which is always a pain point, which is the relationship between the most senior marketing person, let's just say the CMO, and the CEO. I assume you've been in that seat a little bit in the past. But do you have any tips for like managing that relationship?
Look, it's a really great question, because one of the funny things, Tom, like I've probably worked with 60 different, mostly VC-backed B2B SaaS companies at this stage, right? So it's obviously the crucial relationship. There are some commonalities, right? They're invariably very time-pressed, right? So that's always a challenge. But you do find that many of the ones I would be involved with, Tom, would be probably more on their formative years, right? So they're maybe the kind of seed to Series B kind of space, because that's the sweet spot where often they don't have the full C-suite in place and the marketing function is ripe for a fractional, because maybe they don't have the budget for a full-time CMO or the marketing team. So it's a funny place where you can kind of have some interesting challenges dynamically around whether you've got full autonomy or not, right? And sort of marketing is a function where it's very publicly visible from a B2B perspective. And you get CEOs with strong views and strong perspectives as to what you should be doing, because ultimately it's about resource allocation and prioritization. So managing that dynamic can be tricky because, of course, people will have their own views as to what you should be doing. And that can be difficult. Like, I'll give you an example. You could come across a fairly time resource pressed marketing function and the CEO just drops in, look, we'd love to do a webinar next month. Right, seems like a reasonable request, right? But actually, if it's a small team, that's a huge task on top of what they've already got to do. So I guess some of the tips to directly answer your question are probably be really aware of that relationship, good dialogue while recognizing they will be time pressed, trying to really understand what are the bits you can do autonomously that don't need sign off and what are the bits that need to be signed off on them, but also trying to kind of educate them to align on growth expectations, but also on just if the function's being delegated, it's being delegated rather than them needing to wade in on everything.
Yeah, like if the CEO comes in and they're like, we won the webinar, if you've already set out the growth goals and then the activities that you expect to hit those growth goals, then you just say back to the CEO, like, look, we had this plan to hit this level of growth. If you want us to do this, we might not hit that. So should we do this or not? So is that what you mean?
Yeah, well, there's a conversation because ultimately, is the webinar the most effective? It's a task, right? But is it the most effective? So you could have a conversation. So what's the purpose of the webinar? Well, if it is to ultimately drive leads, well, you could argue, well, hold on, if I price out the amount of time it takes to do a webinar in terms of sourcing people, because ultimately the playbooks can be good fits in some scenarios, but bad fits in another scenario. So by that, I mean, if you have a marketing team of one, which is very common in the UK and Ireland in the formative years, that's a huge ask on a team of one. But you mightn't even have the audience on your site. You might not have access to the audience. So you go to all this trouble of creating a webinar, for example, and just not getting enough access points to a big enough audience. And then if they engage with the content, how many of them might actually come through as genuine leads? You might be better served well saying, look, actually, if I price up all the work here, this is a 5 or 10K decision. Could I put this into some other form of paid acquisition that's a lower burden on the team, but might deliver leads to the quality that you need or the volume? So I think it's some of those kind of points that are worth discussing.
All right, let's get specific then. And I want to dig into a couple of campaigns that you have been part of, ideally B2B, but I think that's most of your experience. So the first one is one that you were like, this is never going to work. Maybe someone else in the team was like, let's do this. And then you did it and it was like, wow, it actually worked really well.
So one, I guess, piece of context. So a lot of my work is more on the foundational side of the spectrum because I'll often find that I'm very keen on a back to basics before you start getting too ahead with campaigns. You want to make sure you've got a good visual identity, you've got a decent website, all those elements. So a lot of my work is more on that side of the fence. But in terms of campaigns, there was one that worked pretty well, which was old school direct mail, right? So it was for a client and it was in London. And I think I could probably take the credit for the idea, but I wasn't quite sure that it would be as effective as it played out. But I thought it was in the recruitment space. We were very unknown brand with very modest budgets, but we did a direct mail to something like 50 recruitment people in London with a Starbucks card so that they could go and use it, but they had to kind of get in touch with us to trigger the use of it. So that actually was quite effective because the thinking was there's lots of Starbucks in London. Who doesn't like a free coffee? And actually it was a bit of an old school direct mail approach when most of the stuff we were doing was online. So that was one that was kind of more successful than we had originally envisaged or planned or thought.
But how much did you give them on the Starbucks card?
I think it was £5, if I remember correctly. Not a huge amount.
Got it. So they got the one coffee. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's 2 coffees maybe. So they would then have to reach back out to you. And so then presumably we got some deals from out of the 50 leads, did we?
I can't remember the exact numbers. It's a few years ago, but we definitely, I do recall, I mean, it was probably 5 or 6 decent conversations because that would be the hit rate you'd expect, right? So yeah, look, it was a very effective, from a very modest, low cost type of exercise. Now, we probably weren't equipped to kind of ramp it up. And now when I look back at it, you can always improve these sorts of exercises. I think some of these cards might have got lost in the post, or there's definitely things that you could do differently, but it was old school and quite effective. Again, that mightn't work anymore, Tom, and this is the point, because maybe people are working at home a lot more. Back then, though, it was pre-COVID and people were, London was buzzing and coffee shops were on every corner. So, and you got access to recruiters' details pretty easily because they're very much, it's a role that's very accessible, right? They want to be talking to people. So it was very effective in that use case.
Got it. And then let's also do one that you thought was really going to work, but then actually didn't work that well.
I'm going to bring you back a little bit, Tom, to kind of touching on a few of the points that I made earlier, right? There's been a couple of campaigns recently where I did really nice video creative, and the objective was to use LinkedIn and YouTube as kind of primary routes to get eyeballs on the content. So professionally shot, well scripted, well lit, nice sound bites, nice thumbnail image, cut up quite nicely.
Was this like bottom of the funnel content? So it's like actually about the product or service of the business?
Actually more educational. I mean, I do tend to focus much heavier on the educational side in B2B. So trying to be answering questions that I feel are in a sector. So more, not promotional in features or services and here's the solution, but more just CEOs talking about the broader challenges and how they navigate it. So a bit like today's kind of setup, right? We're trying to share ideas that people can learn from. But when I looked at the kind of organic figures later on both platforms, very disappointing viewer numbers, right? But then I started looking, one of the beauties of my role is I have access to different data points from different clients. And I guess a pattern and trend I'm seeing, Tom, is getting eyeballs on YouTube videos, it just seems, particularly in B2B, right? Because it's obscure and it's more niche. It's getting more challenging. And it goes back to my earlier point, right? I think you need to do one of two things. You need to either put these on the homepage or start paying to promote, right, more aggressively, which kind of brings me back to full circle, which is sort of, I do think you're in a slightly more trickier time in terms of needing to pay to play a little bit more. And it just seems every year that's the direction of travel. I don't know, does that resonate from your experience?
Oh yeah, I definitely put loads of stuff on YouTube and LinkedIn that's got basically no views. So did you guys end up paying to boost the content in the end?
We didn't. And I guess that's another point, right? So a lot of the clients that I work with in Europe, the budgets are relatively constrained. I'd say under the Series A level in particular, it's a battle, right? There's a lot of focus on as much as you can do organically. Clearly with my clients that are Series B, Series C, that's less of a question. But I do think there's a spend around advertising in the marketing channels for more early stage companies, I think is something that is always tricky, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And
that said, sorry, there is one, but I think LinkedIn are doing an opportunity to pay to promote personal posts, which I will test actually, because I think they're historically focused more on company promotion, whereas you're like me on LinkedIn, right? And like many people, LinkedIn is increasingly about following individuals and not going anywhere near company stuff, right? So I think personal promotion will become more important, but we'll have to pay for it again, of course.
Yeah, exactly right. And so in that case, especially if it's like highly polished video content, it's probably quite expensive to produce. And so then the client was like, or the business is like, we spend all this money to produce this content. Now we have to pay more to get it seen. That's probably the conversation the CEO is having with the CMO.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too bad in the sense that kind of the point I made earlier, like the production cost of stuff has come down, right? So you can get freelance videographers in for relatively modest amounts, right? And actually, in many instances, in B2B in particular, with quite a lot of my clients, they're kind of at the deer or elephant or whale end of the spectrum, whereby you don't need huge volumes of viewers. You just need the right ones, the right personas to be looking at it. So there's a little bit more flex on that. But then they're also kind of what I deem foundational, right? I do think video content is valuable, right? In terms of a media, much like a podcast is, because you can really get under the hood and you can kind of hear firsthand the reasons people set up companies, what were the challenges that they were trying to address. So I do think it's very valuable in that context. Of course, you wish then that it could be one that would be a strong correlation with driving leads. But I guess my argument there is part of it is this access to audience that I think is getting trickier.
Totally agree. You mentioned something to me previously about how running lean is a new norm. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I'm probably well experienced in the sort of frugality side of the fence, because again, lots of the challenge with early stage companies is this really tight marketing budget. And actually, again, by way of context, I kind of co-founded a tech startup just over 2 years ago called Contento, which was in the content management space, right? And if I look at the first 2 years of spend, it's pretty much 95% on headcount in the product function, right, to build the software. So I'm well used to kind of this sort of more lean model. And of course, it's complete opposite to some of the kind of narrative that was coming out of the US for the last few years with Reid Hoffman in particular with his book on blitzscaling. But there's some analogs that I think are quite interesting at the moment, Tom, right? So there's a guy, Rand Fishkin, running a business called Spark Toro, and he's well known in the industry. He's come kind of from an SEO world, right? But I think their headcount is 4, right? So, and he's kind of this very interesting character. He's very strong on podcasting like this. He's online. He's got a very strong personal brand. But, I think he's in a pretty comfortable space. I don't think he's taken on VC cash. And it's like that model would not have flown a few years ago, but that's a pretty lean model. And they're very transparent and open. Another example would be the 37 Signals guys, right? David Heinemeier Hansen and Jason Fried, who would be, Hey.com and Basecamp. And again, if you look at their headcount, I think it's around the 100 mark. Whereas if you look at some of their competitors like Asana and Reich and Teamwork and Monday, you're nearing 1,000. So I do think there's an alternative model that's a more frugal approach that's sort of trying to be profitable rather than growth at all cost. It just does mean, though, that it's not always a good fit with the more VC-backed approach, but it's probably a good fit with someone, you get some initial capital in from angels or people that are on a slightly more relaxed growth trajectory, and it's slow and steady rather than trying to shoot the lights out in a couple of years.
Makes total sense. So let's talk about Contento then. How are we getting customers if we're spending 95% of the budget on the product?
Yeah, look, it's great. I've been putting a lot of my tactics to use that I've kind of honed over the years. So look, part of it is just good visibility at the get-go, right? So by that I mean, trying to understand the routes in, to use the language I've used earlier. So strong directory listings, everything from G2 to Capterra to software sites, pretty strong organic with a kind of a tint of staying away from the terms that the competitors are using and trying to look at these long tail terms that are ones that are slower burns, but cumulative over time. It's actually kind of one it's for developers predominantly, right? So our main route to market is through agencies. So it's less of a kind of a direct route to market sell, because often agencies are the primary sort of deciders when it comes to content management systems. So agency partnerships is kind of one of our key pieces. And then I guess we try and pass the sniff test. And by that, I mean, the site is beautifully designed because it's showcasing our power of kind of headless, which is the category we're in. But then it's kind of hitting really hard speed test figures so that, again, anyone looking at it can kind of see that it's actually living up to what it's claiming, which then is leading to kind of fairly decent word of mouth virality. But I kid you not, it is a slow growth trajectory. And it kind of gets back to some of those earlier points. It's a kind of a more frugal, slower trajectory, but it also has to be kind of linked into the broader context. So when we set it up 2 years ago, interest rates were rock bottom, and therefore there was a lot of capital swashing around. We're in a very different economic cycle right now. So you've got to kind of cut your cloth based on the broader context as well, right?
Did you do like personal, like yourself going outbound to their agency partners to sell this to them, or did they come to you?
I did. So I think marketing kind of sits very much in the commercial, where outbound is part of it. So actually, looking at targeted emails, personal emails into accounts. Now, a bit like yourself, I've got a decent network as a starting point. But one of the things that we kind of realized pretty quickly was in the last 2 years, lots of agencies have been really struggling, right? Because going back to my earlier point, you kind of had the interest rate shift and the fact that times were a bit trickier. People weren't refreshing or updating their websites as much as they had been doing the previous years. So we struggled to get decent traction with that outbound approach, but we got a couple. And actually, for where we're at, it's really a couple of strategics rather than a volume game, because of course, the broader agency space, there's still lots of Webflow agencies, there's still lots of WordPress agencies out there. Headless is still a pretty new category, and therefore it's going to take time.
So we're looking to ride the headless wave. Was that like a specific strategy? Like you saw it becoming more of a thing, and so you're like, okay, we can build something here.
It's a good question. Now, it's an awful name, by the way. I don't know who the hell named the category headless, because it's a very developer-centric product, right? But yeah, like if you think about my role is invariably touching websites, right? B2B marketing, your website is your key window on the world. And what I could see was WordPress was increasingly not a good fit for scaling companies, right? So I used to be very frustrated with the interface and the speeds and the kind of vulnerabilities. So I could see the WordPress, it's still a great fit for certain jobs. If you need a quick and cheap website, perfect. But I could see the direction of travel was to one whereby there was less of a kind of a build like you did with the WordPress, where the code is very heavy and sort of all these plugins. And one of my co-founders was also very interested in the space because they ran a website and were suffering from poor speed and sort of inflexible templates and all these vulnerability issues. So that kind of provoked us to look at the space. And we found that actually it was very early in the category sense, but clearly there was a couple of leaders doing exceptionally well with sort of strong revenue figures, but they were also going very much upstream into kind of enterprise and probably being pushed by the VCs to try and increase the share of wallet. So all of a sudden, their solution is phenomenal, but it's getting quite expensive and the feature set is very dense and complicated. So we thought, actually, could we do a lighter weight version of what's out there at a much lower cost? That it's not really just a cost, but the feature set, by being a little bit more constrained, means you're not overwhelmed when you can come in as a junior developer and work in headless, whereas with most of the market leaders, you'd need to be a senior dev. They're just too intimidating to build on. So look, we're early on our journey. It's exciting to be building tech, right, and building code, right? And it's kind of a nice complement to being a fractional CMO as well.
So would you ultimately want to be selling or marketing or doing the business area of Contento full time, or will you always stay with doing the fractional CMO stuff?
It's a very good question. I think one of the things is that I really enjoy the fractional piece. So I'll probably stay doing that a little bit longer, but having a foot in both camps isn't bad, right? That's the beauty of being fractional, right? You're kind of like a portfolio career. So you can kind of manage your time as you see fit, right? So I think that's the attraction of it. You can kind of dial up or dial down depending on your personal requirements at the time.
Makes total sense, Alan. Okay, we're going to link to Contento below, a headless CMS. And then we'll also link to your LinkedIn. Anything else we should link to or mention?
No, that's perfect, Tom.
Alan, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Tom. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you so much, Alan, for coming on. Love the wisdom over the years. Love the insights on building that relationship with the CEO. It's always a tricky one in the world of B2B marketing. So thanks to Alan for coming on. Thanks to Fame for producing this episode. And of course, thanks to you for listening.